Here is the fully rewritten script. Hardened hook, living anarcha, trimmed middle, seamless subscribe moment, and a finale that lands. The doctor who listed his patients as property 30 times. The same woman, the same table, the same hands on the same instruments. 30 operations over 4 years, on a 17-year-old girl whose name the medical register never bothered to record. She appears in the ledger only as owner's property. Number 1. Her outcomes are noted in clinical shorthand. Her suffering is described as distress during procedure. Her resistance, when her body finally could not hold still against the pain, is recorded as a single word: uncooperative. The doctor who wrote that word would go on to be called the father of gynecology. Cities would erect statues in his honor. Medical schools would carve his name above their doors. He would become the personal physician of an empress. And the girl on his table would remain, for 150 years, owner's property. Number 1. Her name was Anarcha. This is her story. And to understand it fully, to understand what was done, how it was justified, and why it was buried for so long, we need to go back to Montgomery, Alabama, in 1845, to a backyard, to a small wooden building with 8 beds, to a physician who believed, with complete sincerity, that he was doing something good. That sincerity is not a defense. It is the most frightening part of the story. The backyard hospital James Marion Sims arrived in Montgomery in 1840, 27 years old, ambitious, and trained at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. He was not a bad man by the standards of his time and place. He was curious, methodical, genuinely committed to solving problems that other physicians had surrendered to. He believed that medicine advanced through observation and experiment, that the body was a mechanism that yielded its secrets to the persistent and disciplined investigator. He set up practice on South Perry Street in a city built entirely on cotton money and enslaved labor. Montgomery in 1840 was a place where the commerce of human beings was conducted in the same ledgers and columns as the commerce of cotton bales, recorded with the same practiced hand, subject to the same calculations of value and depreciation. Sims treated white patients in his upstairs office. Increasingly, he received enslaved patients brought to him by their owners when illness threatened to diminish the value of their property. It was through these visits that Sims first encountered vesico-vaginal fistula. The condition was a catastrophic complication of prolonged or obstructed labor, a tear between the bladder and the vaginal wall that left a woman permanently incontinent, in constant pain, prone to infection, and, in the medical consensus of the era, completely beyond repair. Medical journals described it as among the most distressing conditions a physician could encounter. Almost universally, those same journals concluded there was nothing to be done. Sims believed otherwise. In 1845, a plantation owner named Westcott brought him a 17-year-old girl who had survived 3 days of agonizing labor. The baby had lived. The girl had not been so fortunate. Her name was Anarcha, and she would carry the physical damage of that birth for the rest of her life, unless someone could find a way to repair what had been torn. Sims examined her. By his own later account, he was immediately and completely certain he could develop a surgical solution. He needed only to experiment. He asked Westcott if he could keep Anarcha at his home for the duration of his work. Westcott agreed. The logic was clean and transactional. If Sims succeeded, Anarcha would be returned more valuable than before. If he failed, nothing had been lost except time. Sims built a small outbuilding behind his house. 4 beds initially, then 8. He began receiving other enslaved women with the same condition, brought from plantations across 3 counties by owners who had calculated, as Westcott had, that the arrangement might pay. Over the following months, he gathered 5 women, then 7, then as many as 12 at various points. He provided their food and basic clothing. Their owners paid no fees. It was, in the ledger of human commerce, an ordinary arrangement. He listed them in his register as owner's property, followed by a number. He never listed their names. What the register said, The medical ledger that documented Sims's experiments survived in a wooden crate in the basement of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, buried under 40 years of uncatalogued estate paperwork and plantation inventories. It had survived the Civil War, 2 floods, and the patient indifference of time. A historical preservation archivist named Dr. Eleanor Voss opened the crate in the spring of 2011. She was expecting deed transfers, tax rolls, the ordinary residue of a dead world. The ledger covered 1845 to 1849. Its pages were stiff with age but perfectly legible, written in a physician's practiced hand in brown ink that had once been black. It documented surgical procedures. It recorded diagnoses. It noted outcomes in the compressed clinical language of 19th century medicine. Where a patient's name should have appeared, there was a legal status and a number. Owner's property. Number 1. Female. Age approximately 17. Condition: vesico-vaginal fistula. Severe. Procedure: experimental repair. First attempt. Outcome: failed. Patient survived. Owner's property. Number 2. Female. Age approximately 22. Condition: same. Procedure: experimental repair. Third attempt. Outcome: failed. Patient survived. Significant distress during procedure. Owner's property. Number 7. Female. Age approximately 20. Third procedure. Patient became uncooperative during operation. Assistance required to hold patient in position. Procedure completed. Outcome: partial success. 41 entries. 41 women and girls. 4 years of operations on bodies that the register never once acknowledged as belonging to persons rather than owners. Dr. Voss brought the ledger to Dr. Marcus Reed, a historian of medicine at the University of Alabama, who had spent 15 years studying the intersection of slavery and antebellum medical practice. They sat with the document for 3 days before either spoke at length about what they were reading. "I thought I understood the shape of what had happened," Reed later said. "I'd read the critiques and the defenses. I thought I knew." And then Eleanor put this ledger in front of me, and I realized I had been reading the sanitized version. This was the original. One annotation in the margin stopped him completely. Next to the entry for owner's property, number 23, added in slightly different ink, written later as a note to the record, were 3 words: purchased for experiments. Sims had bought a woman. When her owner declined the loan arrangement, Sims spent his own money to acquire her specifically as a research subject. The notation was 3 words long. It sat in its column as matter-of-factly as any other accounting entry. Reed said he sat very still for a long time after reading it. 3 words, he said, purchased for experiments, and she has no name. Before we go further, if you're watching this and you feel the weight of what these records contain, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. These are the histories that didn't make it into the textbooks, the ones written not in monuments and eulogies, but in patient registers and property columns. Share this with someone who should know this story. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's go back to Montgomery, to Anarcha, and to what she was never allowed to say. The woman on the table here is what Anarcha's life looked like in the years the ledger recorded. She rose before dawn. She moved through her days in a body that had been permanently damaged by a labor she had survived at 17. The fistula meant constant leaking, constant wetness, constant low-grade infection, the kind of physical condition that in any other circumstance would have excused a person from all demanding activity. Anarcha had no such excuse. She was property. She worked. And periodically, irregularly, with no warning she could prepare for, she was brought to Sims's outbuilding and placed on his examination table. Sims operated without anesthesia. Ether anesthesia became available in 1846, 1 year into his experiments. By 1847, it was widely used in surgical practice across the country. Sims used it on some patients in some circumstances. He did not use it on the women in his backyard hospital. His stated reason, offered decades later in his autobiography, was that black patients had a different pain tolerance. that the procedures, though painful, were bearable for women of African descent in ways they would not be for white women. This belief was not unique to Sims. It was a widespread medical ideology, a story that practitioners across the American South told themselves so they could continue doing what they were doing without the burden of fully registering what it meant. It had no scientific basis. It was a convenient fiction worn smooth by repetition. The ledger recorded what the fiction was being used to justify. Significant distress during procedure. Assistants required to hold patient in position. Patient survived. By the second year of experiments, Sims's 2 white male surgical assistants had quit. The procedures were too distressing. They couldn't continue. Sims replaced them with the only people available to him who had no choice in the matter. He replaced them with the women themselves. He trained Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy, and the others in his surgical techniques. They learned to prepare instruments. They learned sterile practice as Sims understood it. They learned to steady each other on the table, to maintain pressure during procedures, to hand tools at the right moment. The same women whose bodies provided the experimental data became the skilled hands that made the experiments possible. Think about what that means. Anarcha had been through more than a dozen failed operations. She knew the instruments by touch. She knew what each procedure felt like from inside the body being operated on. She understood Sims's techniques from a perspective no medical journal would ever record, because medical journals did not ask her. She brought that knowledge to the table, literally, every time she assisted on another woman's procedure. The knowledge that would eventually produce a genuine breakthrough in women's medicine was built, in no small part, by Anarcha. Her name appears in Sims's published account as a case. The breakthrough that buried them. In 1849, after 4 years and dozens of failed attempts, Sims found what worked: silver wire sutures instead of silk, a modified speculum that he had actually asked a Montgomery blacksmith to fabricate, based on a bent pewter spoon he had improvised during an earlier examination. A refined surgical approach shaped by every failure that had preceded it, every iteration that had not worked, every procedure that had been performed on women who had no power to decline. The repair held. The fistula closed. The technique was reproducible. Sims published his results in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences in 1852. The paper was a sensation. Vesico-vaginal fistula, once considered incurable, was now fixable. Women who had been condemned to lives of pain and isolation could be healed. The medical establishment recognized immediately that something significant had happened. The paper mentioned Anarcha by name. It mentioned Lucy. It mentioned Betsy. It described them as cases, problems that had been solved. It did not describe the 30 operations. It did not describe the 4 years. It did not describe the moment when Sims's white assistants walked away and the enslaved women became both subjects and surgical team. It described Sims as a dedicated physician who had persisted where others had given up. It described the women as fortunate recipients of his attention. The paper made Sims famous. He moved to New York. He founded the Woman's Hospital of New York, which became one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country. He traveled to Europe. He became the personal physician of Empress Eugénie of France. He received honorary doctorates. He was, by every measure available to the era, a celebrated man. Anarcha went back to the Westcott plantation. What her life looked like after 1849, whether the repair held, whether she had more children, whether she lived to see emancipation in 1865, whether she found any form of the ordinary life that had been interrupted when she was put on a table at 17, the record does not clearly say. She vanishes from the documented history the way she entered it, as a case number, as a name attached to someone else's breakthrough, as owner's property. Number 1. The Architecture of Erasure. Dr. Eleanor Voss retired from the Alabama Department of Archives in 2019. She has spoken about the ledger at universities and historical societies across the country. She chooses her words carefully when she discusses it, because she understands the weight that each one carries. What the ledger shows you she said in a 2020 lecture at the University of Alabama, is that the erasure wasn't incidental. It wasn't an accident of record keeping. It was the point. When you write owner's property number 1 instead of a name, you are making a choice. You are deciding that this person's identity is not relevant information. You are deciding that what matters is the procedure and the outcome, and the body providing the data is property, not a person. James Marion Sims did not invent that choice. He was born into a world that had already made it, written it into the law, the economy, the social fabric of everything around him. The choice had been made long before he picked up his scalpel, but he made it again. Every single entry in that ledger is him making it again, 41 times. And they add up. They add up to 4 years of a girl's life. They add up to 30 operations on one young woman. They add up to a career built on suffering that was never compensated, never acknowledged, and for 150 years, never named. Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens, whose 2017 book Medical Bondage is the definitive modern account of Sims's experiments, placed anarcha at the center of the story in a way Sims's own published work never did. These women were not passive recipients of medical attention, Cooper Owens wrote. They were active participants in the development of surgical technique, trained by Sims himself after his white assistants quit, performing procedures alongside him, maintaining his equipment, sustaining his experiments through their own learned skill. The knowledge that produced modern gynecology was not Sims alone. It was created in collaboration, forced collaboration, with women his ledger called owner's property. The word collaboration is important. It is not a softening of what happened. It is an insistence that Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy be seen as agents in the story, not only as victims of it, that their knowledge, their endurance, their involuntary expertise be recognized as constitutive of the outcome, not merely incidental to it. They were not just the raw material. They were part of the intelligence that shaped the result. History gave the result to one man's name. The names returning historians working in the years after Voss's discovery were able to identify, with reasonable confidence, approximately 12 of the 41 women documented in the ledger's pages. Some were traced through plantation birth records and ownership documents cross-referenced against Sims's known patient history. 2 were identified through records of the Alabama Freedmen's Bureau, which documented formerly enslaved people in the years after emancipation. Women whose mothers had been patients, whose family oral histories had preserved some fragment of what the official archive had erased. Anarcha's full name, Anarcha Westcott, the surname taken from the plantation, was confirmed by researchers who spent years following her trail through fragmentary records. She had been 17 in 1845. She had survived 3 days of labor and then 30 operations without anesthesia. She had been trained in surgical assistance by the physician who was simultaneously operating on her body. She had been returned to the plantation after the experiments concluded. After that, silence. The archive, which had never prioritized her survival, provided no further documentation. Lucy had nearly died during the first year of Sims' experiments. Blood poisoning so severe that Sims himself, by his own later account, believed she would not survive. She did survive. She was returned to her owner. She disappears from the record. Betsy's trail ends even earlier. She appears in Sims's published accounts and in the ledger. Then she is simply gone, not recorded as deceased, not traced to any subsequent plantation document, not found in the Freedmen's Bureau files. Whether she died during or after the experiments, was sold away, or simply fell through the cracks of an archive that had never been designed to catch her, historians cannot determine. The 29 other women in the ledger, listed as owner's property, number 13 through number 41, remain for the most part unidentified. Their names exist somewhere, in records not yet digitized, in family oral histories not yet collected. In the space between official documents, where the actual texture of enslaved life persisted in defiance of the archive's indifference, researchers are still looking. What remains? The statue of James Marion Sims that stood in Central Park for over a century was relocated in 2018. The debates around it were contentious, and they should have been. The story is genuinely complicated, and the medical advances are real, and the suffering that produced them is also real, and neither fact cancels the other. But the ledger is not complicated. Owner's property. Number 1. That is not complexity. That is a choice, written 41 times, in brown ink that was once black, in a physician's careful hand, in a backyard hospital in Montgomery, Alabama, where a 17-year-old girl was placed on a table and operated on without anesthesia, and described, when her body reacted to unbearable pain, as uncooperative. The ledger sits now in an acid-free archival box in the climate-controlled collection of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. It has been digitized. Scholars can access it. The 41 entries with their clinical notations and their absent names are part of the permanent record. The history of medicine is written in breakthroughs and the names of the men who achieved them. James Marion Sims's name is in that history. His techniques are still taught. The repair he developed is the ancestor of procedures performed in hospitals around the world today. Anarcha's name is in that history now too, placed there by scholars who spent years returning it to where it had been deliberately omitted. Lucy's name. Betsy's name. 12 names recovered from 41. 29 still being searched for. The record was never meant to be read this way. It was meant to be a ledger of property, an accounting of procedures, a document that made no claims about humanity because it did not recognize any humanity to claim. But someone always reads the ledger eventually. And when they do, the property numbers resolve into women, and the women resolve into lives, and the lives refuse. No matter how the column heads it, no matter what the law said, no matter whose name got carved above the door, to remain anyone's property. Her name was Anarcha. She was 30 times on that table. She is not a case number. She never was. If this story stayed with you, if Anarcha's name should be remembered, subscribe. Share this. These histories survive only because people refuse to let them be forgotten again. Leave a comment. Where are you watching from, and whose story do you think history still owes a reckoning? We'll see you in the next one.